Paul, I actually want to just start with you because there's a couple of questions on the Kraft test, and Kraft's original test was 100 grams of glucose versus the 75 grams that we do in Australia. Could you just tell us a little bit about what your experience is of the results of that compared to what Kraft did with his 100-gram test?
So, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Joseph Kraft did probably about 30,000 of these in America several decades ago, and he's actually the pioneer of this test of diagnosing insulin resistance. But in the States, they used 100 grams of glucose, and in Australia, we use a 75-gram load of glucose. So we had a bit of a question, well, can we actually translate the results from the US into our results that we're getting in the clinic now? And we thought maybe yes, we thought maybe no. Theoretically, 75 grams of glucose is meant to be a maximal pancreatic stimulus, which means that it will cause a maximum secretion of insulin from the pancreas, which is good for insulin, but we don't really know how that relates to blood glucose level. So we've done over 400 of these now, and we've actually started doing some preliminary analysis. And we actually have got some data which is just about ready for publication. And we actually find that the thresholds that Kraft used for insulin are actually pretty comparable to what we've actually found. Probably more excitingly, we've started doing some correlational research looking at lipids as well. So the triglyceride fat in the blood, the HDL, the good level of cholesterol, and we've actually found that we can use the ratio between the HDL and the triglyceride, and that actually can give us some statistically significant association with insulin resistance. So we're hoping to publish that later on in the year, but it's going to be quite exciting because that means that you don't necessarily then have to go off for a 2-hour blood test to get an early indication if you're insulin resistant. You might be able to just do a fasting blood test, have a look at your triglyceride, have a look at your HDL, run a calculation, and you can have an estimate of whether you're going to be insulin resistant or not.
Thanks, Paul. Jess, can I ask you, I want to eat LCHF. Do I have to weigh and measure all of my food?
Sure. Well, there's obviously a lot of different phases when you go LCHF, and you don't necessarily have to weigh and measure all your food. People come in all the time and they just freak out. Do I have to count calories, carbohydrates, things like that? Definitely the first phase, as you call it, would just be to eat more of the food that we know is good for us, the foods that Taryn was talking about that she was putting in her recipes. Don't worry too much about the grams of things and the amounts of things. But, you know, for some people who want to get into therapeutic levels of ketosis for certain reasons, then maybe you will need to weigh things and measure things and do that for a little bit of time. But eventually it becomes second nature and you don't have to be doing that. And sometimes it's just about awareness. Like, sometimes I'll say to people, just count your carbohydrates for one day. Don't change anything, just count them and see how much you're actually eating and see what foods contain carbohydrate and just learn through your own experiments and things like that. But certainly, no, you don't necessarily have to weigh and measure everything you eat.
All right, thanks. Rod, I might actually go across the panel with this question. There's people that are asking about lower socioeconomic communities and saying that really they can't afford to buy what we would consider, healthy, low-carb, high-fat food. Can we just talk about your experience just with the cost of the food?
I think a Big Mac's around about $8 or something like that. So what can you get for that $8? How many eggs can you get? How much mince can you get? How much butter can you get? How much cream can you get? These foods are pretty inexpensive relatively to processed food.
And I'm probably going to steal a couple of people's answers, but if you eat LCHF, you eat less often. So you're not having to buy as much food, or you don't need to take snacks with you if you're going out for a whole day and things like that. So even if one meal is more expensive, you end up eating less meals over time. So it works out better.
If you eat a bespoke low carb diet, there's no doubt it can get expensive. If you're having your organic macadamia nuts and your grass-fed meat and all of these, it can get expensive. But a lot of the low carb staples are not expensive. And I've had several patients who have told me that their food bill has gone down eating low carb. Processed foods are expensive as well. Those TV snacks, they're not cheap. The chocolates, the addictive foods, they're actually relatively expensive because they can be, because they're addictive. You're going to buy them anyway. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer that the low carb diet is necessarily expensive. If you want it to be expensive and eat like a king, then you can, but you can still do good quality low carb keto on a budget.
So on that thing, what are the foods that like a person really needs to lose weight? Is it all right for them to go to McDonald's and get a burgerless bun? Is that better for them than bunless burger? So, are we better off saying to people, look, if you don't eat grass-fed, you're not allowed to do this diet? Or, look, if you're driving through, and your only food source, because you're out driving somewhere and there's nowhere else you can buy the food, it's okay to get the bunless burger?
I think Rod here last year at a conference, he had a great response to a question based on artificial sweeteners, which is entirely applicable. And it's a lesser of two evils. So do I ever go to McDonald's and get a burger and ask them to hold the bun, understanding that it's probably cooked in vegetable oils and it's probably not perfect? Yes, when I'm travelling, I will do that because it's the lesser of two evils. So certainly you make a conscious decision based on what's available at the time and you make the best choice you can. Now, it's not always a perfect world, but you can always make a better choice.
Thanks. Taryn, one of the comments is that my kids won't tolerate that. They love sugar. I know you sort of answered this beforehand. What's the process? How long does it take to get kids lower carb? And is it all right if they go to party and they still have sugar?
So I think it very much will depend also on what they're getting outside, which you can't control. I mean, my kids do go to parties. They know that what they're allowed. They know they're allowed X amount. Treats, like 3 treats and then a small piece of cake. Because there's no way I'm going to say to them, go to the party and don't eat. I'm not. And so when you're initially trying to, is that just me? And when you're initially trying to get them and wean them off the sugar and get them on board with this, the more control you have, the better initially. And it's going to take a different amount of time per child. I have one of my 3-year-old's best friends from school. The mother came over with him. They had their play date the other day for the first time. And she said to me, oh my gosh, I was so excited. I've never seen kids enjoy and get so excited about healthy food before. And her son is an absolute sugar addict. And he sat there and he ate my pumpkin bread and loved it. And since then, I think it's been maybe 6 weeks. She said she has noticed, she's completely come on board, she's making big changes, but incrementally, to what they eat, to what she sends for school, and in 6 weeks she has noticed incredible changes in his behaviour, in his need for treats. He used to get in the car after school and ask straight away for treats. She says he gets in the car now and he doesn't ask for anything because he's had a better lunch at school, he's not having these cravings anymore, and his behaviour and concentration has improved exponentially. But in the last 6 weeks, she's been massively committed. So, and he's still on his way, and she's doing exactly what I said, half a cup of coconut sugar. So she made the pumpkin bread, she added in some maple syrup, she's working her way down. So it'll depend what your child will tolerate. You don't want to give them something and then turn their nose up to it. So that's what I was saying before. Give it to them with the sugar in it, and then when you feel you can start incrementally decreasing, but adjust it as you need to for that particular child. It's very hard for me to put a number on how long it's going to take, I guess. But I think if you can control the situation as best as you can initially, then they're fine at a later stage to have some leeway. They're kids, you've got to be able to do that. But it's really going to be a very individual thing.
So reducing the sugar overall is still much better for them than allowing them to eat what a standard Australian diet would be?
Absolutely. I think anything that you can do, even if it's incremental, slowly, little bits at a time, it's going to be better overall, absolutely.
And Paul, what effect does that have on the kids in terms of the dopamine response in the long run?
exactly the same as in adults. So if you expose a young child to the sweet taste, they will become habituated to it, they will seek it, and they'll continue to need more and more and more for the same benefit. So my wife up the front here, Fiona, will tell you about, we've got a little 2.5-year-old, and he goes crazy if he sees a strawberry. Now, that's because that's his level of habituation to sweetness. He gets berries. And for him, personally, that's baby cocaine. Whereas other children, they would turn their noses up at a strawberry, they'd want something sweeter. So you like what you're used to. And whatever you're used to having, the brain always wants that little bit more. So if you turn it down, as Taryn said, then over time those receptors will change in the same way that we saw in the lecture where I put the picture up of the dopamine receptors in an obese individual. Those changes will also occur in children.
Rod, you've had some experience with fasting. There's a question here about feeling a bit tired or lethargic, with this way of eating, particularly when fasting. Could you just tell us a little bit about your experiences with fasting and whether monitoring your continuous blood glucose stuff has made any difference with your thought processes with that?
Right. Well, first thing, if you're going to fast, it's better to have started on a low-carb, high-fat diet. So you haven't got those glucose swings and you haven't got those hypoglycemic bits. So you're much more stable to start with. And at that point, it's easier to drop a meal, as in maybe drop breakfast. It's easier to cut out those snacks. So I must say I don't find many of those symptoms that you described about feeling not so good on this. One thing, if you were to encounter that sort of symptoms, salt, ordinary salt is a great remedy for that, because when we go low carb, we do lose a lot of water, we lose a lot of salt with it, and we need to replace that. So I think you get better at it. And in fact, one of the things about fasting is just really how easy it is. Every now and again you might think, oh, I could use something. Just put that thought aside, 15 seconds later it's gone. So I think real, true, gnawing hunger does not persist. And I'm talking about, relatively short fasting periods, missing a meal or two. So I highly recommend it. I think it's really good. I'm probably not the most smooth, even eater that has balance every day, and it works for me every now and again to just go on a little bit more time-restricted eating, and I get back to the sort of weight I like to be. One last point was when you fast, even for a few days, your metabolic rate actually goes up and you get more done.
So that's a comment that I'll come back to you in a second, Paul. This morning I had to get up fairly early to do ward rounds before I started organising this. So I haven't had breakfast today. Anybody else skip breakfast today? Yeah, so it's pretty standard now in this environment, right? So, the reality is probably I won't eat till dinner tonight. And on an operating day, Gary, I'm sure will say the same thing, there's not usually time to do that. So you either get up a bit earlier, have a big breakfast, a couple of, eggs and cheese and whatever you have, and then you might not eat till that night or breakfast the next day, or you skip breakfast and lunch and eat dinner, but you've got to keep going with your water and make sure you don't get salt depleted, as Rod said. And I think that's probably the most common thing, is the salt depletion giving people headaches and that fatigue feeling. And in fact, the longer you fast, for me anyway, the more alert I feel, rather than the other way around. Paul, you were going to say something?
I'd just like to give a bit of a heads up on what for most of you will be some breaking news on salt. And very quietly, I won't say under the cover of darkness, but last year the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, performed a review of the dietary guidelines for sodium intake in late September. And they haven't made much fanfare about the results. But what they've actually done is they've removed the recommended upper limit for individual sodium consumption. So I'll just let that sink in. So there is no longer a maximum salt intake, or sodium, more technically correct, that is recommended by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So now this is a little, if you have a look at their website, that's not very clear, because on the other hand, what they've done is they said for an individual there's no clear evidence of a threshold beyond which harm occurs. So we've removed the upper limit. However, they said we still recommend a population average and would like the average person in the population to reduce their sodium intake to 2 grams a day, but that doesn't apply to an individual. So obviously they contradict. So all I can imagine is that in the back room there would have been 2 vociferously very verbal groups opposing each other, and that was probably the halfway house that said, well, you can make your population recommendation and we'll make our recommendation for you, the individual. Now, one further point is that the data on which they based the population recommendation, they calculated their data, and in much the same way that Marianne presented data on statins, they hypothesised an effect. They hypothesised that by reducing the sodium intake in the Australian diet to 2 grams a day, on average they'd be able to get a massive blood pressure reduction of 2 millimetres of mercury. So, and that is, I kid you not, this is the science on which they've based the population recommendation, not mortality data, which actually the mortality data shows that people will die more. Just a blood pressure reduction of 2.
Sure.
Just very, very quickly, intermittent fasting is relatively new for me. I only started doing that probably about a year or so ago. And I started doing it on days where I wasn't training because I was scared of feeling like drops in energy and not getting, the most out of my workout. I've now switched that, and I skip breakfast on my training days. And then I'll train after I finish clients, so around lunchtime. And it has made the world of difference to my training. I'm getting more out of my training. I'm stronger, I feel better, and then I also find that if I do it on a non-training day, by lunchtime I'm ready to eat. If I fast on a training day, after I train, I find that I can actually go longer as long as I'm keeping my salt and my water up. So that's been a big epiphany for me, and it's definitely changed my training.
And really the question is it intermittent fasting, or is it really just eating when you're hungry? So turn it on head. I'm not fasting. Fasting is deprivation and not allowing myself to do all those other things. It's actually just eating when you feel hungry. And I visited an overseas a gentleman who does a lot of weight loss stuff, who basically said, if you're driving along the highway and you get that little urge to wee, you're not going to pull over on the highway and wee straight away. You're going to wait until that urge is quite strong. So when you feel that little hunger pang, right, that first hunger pang, just let it go away wait until that hunger pang comes quite strong before you eat. Jess, is the way that we cook the food important from a dietitian's perspective? So, if I steam the meat versus barbecuing the meat, do I get much difference if I'm a type 1 diabetic? It's a tough question.
You have type 1 diabetes specifically?
Well, if you know the answer to that, yes. If not, any way you'd like to answer the question.
I'm not going to pretend I know the answer. I do know that if you have type 1 diabetes, that fat does still have an impact on blood glucose. But for example, if you have fat with carbohydrate, it will slow the release of blood glucose into the blood. So that may affect how you dose insulin. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something you need to keep aware of. And then for the average person, I would say that however you enjoy cooking your food, cook your food like that. Obviously there's better ways to do it and worse ways to do it, and obviously if you're going out and you're getting deep fried pumpkin, it's probably not as good as just putting it in the oven and roasting it on a lower heat and using better oils. But apart from that, I have no specific recommendations. It's more what the person enjoys doing and is good for them.
Paul, from a weight loss perspective, have you seen any difference in the way people cook their foods?
Well, obviously cooking in a high-fat manner tends to increase the fat content, and that's good for suppressing hunger. Probably just with regards to diabetes, it relates to advanced glycated end products as well. These chemicals that have been mentioned in a couple of talks already, Gary certainly had a big focus on it. there's two sources. Your body can make them, or you can actually ingest them as well. And we know that when you're cooking meats on a high temperature, especially dry cooking, it does lead to the formation of some of these products within meat. So there is certainly a putative benefit of slow cooking your meat at a lower temperature on more moist cooking. That will actually lead to a reduction in the amount of advanced glycated end products that you ingest. And there's certainly a theoretical benefit to that.
Rod, you've been around doing this for a very long time. Not that you're old, but you've certainly been leading the way along before a lot of other people were. And so you've had plenty of time to talk to people about ketones and ketone testing, and also your personal experience with this. Now, particularly with the continuous glucose monitoring, do you believe there's an optimal time of day to test for ketones, morning, afternoon, evening? Do you find it alters with your exercise, or is it something that you've just not really done very much of?
Look, I've often tested twice a day because when you wake up in the morning, it's an easy time to test. But you tend to get your highest ketones late in the afternoon after having not eaten since lunchtime. So if you want some encouragement, you test late in the day. The other thing I would say with regard to blood glucose, in the morning there's often this thing called the dawn phenomenon where your blood glucose is higher. And I had somebody who was contacted me with cancer who was trying to be really ketogenic, keeping the glucose low. In fact, ideally, getting your glucose number below your ketone number. So that might be ketones of 4 and a blood glucose of 3.5. They were doing everything right except for one thing. They were measuring in the morning. And when they measured in the morning, they said, we just can't meet this target. So that'd be my answer for convenience. Test as soon as you wake up. But if you really want to G yourself up with some good numbers, do it late in the afternoon.
And Paul, again, your experience with the clinic, you've seen lots of patients now. What are your thoughts? I mean, you use this as a tool for the patients. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you use it with the patients?
Well, we certainly have to totally agree with Rod that measuring the ketones later in the day seems to provide slightly higher readings and more repeatable results. And the reproducibility is the key. So some people, if you're very insulin resistant, we might accept a ketone level of 0.3 millimolar. Whereas if you're younger and you're not insulin resistant, then we want you to be over 0.5 or even up to 1. So rather than aiming for an absolute level, we tend to also look at the trends. And that's why my first lecture, when we showed you the diary and you can see the fluctuations, it's the fluctuations in the ketones which are very important. And just with regards to blood glucose level, the meter that Rod demonstrated before, which is giving him minute by minute blood glucose readings around the clock at the moment, we've got a few of those meters in some of my patients at the moment. And in the people who are doing more keto, we're actually seeing their blood sugars in the middle of the night are even getting down towards 3s and even into the high 2s. And this is traditionally what's called hypoglycemia. And I think we just don't know about this because we've never tested people overnight. But these blood sugars which are going down, it's very interesting. We're probably going to need to do some research on it. But I suspect we know that ketones can increase overnight as well as certainly there's called starvation ketosis. Not starvation ketosis, but ketones are often on the breath in the morning. And by having those higher, it actually permits blood glucose to go lower without these side effects. And that's going to be something interesting for us to monitor in the future.
Paul, your triglycerides go down when you eat this type of diet generally. What happens to them? Where do they go?
So the process of de novo lipogenesis, that's the liver making fat. And that can actually release triglycerides into the bloodstream. So if you don't make them, they're not there. I think that's probably the easiest way.
All right, very good. So if you have any more questions, please send them down. We're actually going to change panels now. So if we can thank our current panel speakers.